Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for signing up and choosing to share your Friday morning with us here on our first system symposium, virtual symposium, focused on excellence through equity-minded teaching. I know a lot of you, I've been reading your introductions, and so really glad to see so many of you here today. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Landon Purius, and I'm the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs. I mentioned it earlier, today we have approximately 500 participants who have registered for this symposium, and that is at least one person from every one of our colleges. And we also have some partners here from other institutions who will be joining us today as well. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just want to set the stage a little bit and talk about the morning and take just a couple minutes to do so. So I think most individuals are well aware that as a system and as a set of colleges, we have identified equity as a priority. Our board, our chancellor, our presidents, my team, and vice president's council have all indicated that addressing equity for our system, for our colleges, and for our communities is really a high priority for us. And many of you also might remember that a little over a year ago, we had a Teaching Excellence with Equity grant that the board had set aside $5 million over 3 years that would go to colleges to be able to expand their equity work, especially in the classroom environment. And then, of course, the pandemic struck and those plans all got put on hold. But I'm really excited that today is an opportunity to restart our efforts as a system in terms of teaching excellence with equity. Shortly after today, I will be reopening the grant application process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in our closing session at the end of the day today. But I did want to just take a moment to share why equity is important to us as a system. So first and foremost, who we serve. We serve a very diverse student population, over almost 40% students of color and 60% first generation students. And we also serve very diverse communities. Yet when we look at our outcomes in terms of graduation, or our outcomes in terms of completion of Gateway English and Math in the first semester, we continue to see sustained inequities across our student demographics. We do have pockets where those gaps have been closed. And those pockets are often where there have been efforts, either as a college, as a department, or as individual instructors, where there have been efforts to change the approach inside of the classroom. And so this focus that we have is on, again, equity-mindedness as it relates to teaching and what happens inside of the classroom. So when we decided to re-kick off our grant initiative, we felt like it was important to have an event like this symposium, to really kind of kickstart our efforts. And there are a number of individuals who I'd like to thank, who were part of the team who brought today's events forward. And I'll just mention them by name. Love for them to stand up, but obviously in this environment, we cannot do that. So we have Lynette Bates, Ruth Ann Orihuela, Tricia Johnson, Bobby Pace, Josh Baker, Amy Kahn, Ryan Ross, Dan and Job, and Stacy Amaya. All of these individuals worked closely with me over the last several months to put this virtual event on. And I want to take a moment just to thank them for their time and their effort and their dedication to not only this event, but also to equity-mindedness. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Ariel Rogers. And I promised her that I would not read her bio, so I won't, but I will say this. Ariel came highly recommended from one of our own colleagues, James Gray from the Community College of Aurora. Many of you know James, math faculty member, has worked with the Center of Urban Education, has worked, of course, very tirelessly at the Community College of Aurora, but also with a number of other colleges and faculty across our system. So I think very highly of James, and when he recommended Ariel, I knew right away that I wanted to ask her to this event. And so when she said yes, I was very excited. And then we had a conversation prior to today to just kind of get on the same page and understand where we were going as a system and what expertise she brings to the table. And she hit on all of the topics that we are talking about and will continue to talk about as a system: inclusive pedagogy, expansive learning environments, intersectionality, professional development, transformation, and so on. And so Ariel's keynote title is Toward Transgressive Teaching and Acting Pedagogies for Life, Love, and Liberation in Higher Education. And so please join me in welcoming Ariel.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. I really appreciate, again, James recommending me for this and Landon reaching out and inviting me. So let's get started. So I want to start, like I start all of my talks, with a land acknowledgement. And so you can see the outside of my window. I'm sitting in a sunny place, and I really think it's important to start off by acknowledging and honoring the traditional and unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, where I live and work. Some people call this Chicago. This region is also home to other tribes such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox. And I offer deep respect and gratitude to these communities, their legacies of care for the land of waterways, past, present, and future. And I know that we have people from all over the state of Colorado. And if you're interested in learning more about the histories of the land that you occupy, I suggest that you go to native-land.ca, and you can learn more about the land and the tribes that have been traditionally and rightfully the caretakers of those lands. I also want to provide a labor acknowledgement, right? A lot of what we enjoy today was created off of the backs of enslaved Africans, right? And so I particularly use a labor acknowledgement that was written by Dr. Melina Abdullah, who is a professor of Pan-African Studies at CSU LA, and she's a co-founder of Black Lives Matter LA. And she writes, "We pay homage to those who were stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, falsely named as chattel, who were slaves but never submitted to such, and have always been fully human, with an unbroken connection to the divine and to each other. We honor our African ancestors for the still unpaid labor which built what is now called the Americas." And I also want to acknowledge South Shore, the community that I am from, where I am right now. It's always really interesting feeling when I'm giving these keynotes. I'm on the enclosed front porch of the apartment that I grew up in, literally sitting in a space where my grandmother and great aunt would sit out and look at the community. They were on kind of community watch, like figuring out what was happening. I always say that I learned how to be an ethnographer from them. And so, you know, South Shore is a vibrant Black community on Chicago's South Side, and it's my home and my refuge. So I wanted to name that as well. So I think it's radically important that I situate myself in the work that I do. So I wanted to kind of introduce myself. Again, my name is Ariel Rogers. I use she, her pronouns. some things that you should know about me, I think. First of all, I am an incredibly proud Black woman who comes from a long lineage of incredibly proud Black women. And I think that that's relevant in kind of the pedagogical approach that I take, as well as the sort of like onto-epistemologies that I take up in my work. I'm a first generation college graduate. My grandmother was only able to complete up to the fourth grade because she was born to sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta. And they, you know, they were tending to the land, right? And so she migrated to Chicago, and that's where my mother was born. My mother attended college for about a year and a half, and ended up having to leave to come back to take care of my grandmother after my grandfather passed. So I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college, the first person to be pursuing a PhD, and I find great honor in that, in terms of like the broader legacy. In terms of what I studied social policy with a minor in Latinx studies, and I did a master's in learning sciences, both at Northwestern University. And currently I'm enrolled in the urban education policy program at the University of Southern California. Even though I'm finishing the program from Chicago. Don't let the sun deceive you. And I consider myself to be an educator first and foremost, and I'm an education researcher, and my research is kind of situated around how racial meaning occurs in classroom teaching at particularly white serving institutions of higher education. So places like Northwestern and USC. I'm really interested in understanding kind of how faculty and students jointly make sense of what race means in teaching and learning. So I want to start off with some key concepts to ground us in what it is that we're talking about today. And these concepts are interrelated but distinct. And so I think it's important that we kind of operationally define them before we kind of get started. So first, race. I use a definition of race that comes from Patrick Wolf, and he defines race as a classificatory concept that is both hierarchical and links physical characteristics to cognitive, cultural, and moral ones, right? So again, it's the idea of race as being like both real and socially constructed, right? So there are physical differences, like we can observe the physical differences, but it's particularly the types of meaning that gets associated with those differences that matter for like the material realities of people's lives, right? And so racism, conversely, is the state-sanctioned and or legal production of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So I'm going to say that part again. Group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And Ruthie Gilmore describes this as being in distinct yet densely interconnected geographies. So again, when we're thinking about what's at stake, death, premature death is at stake. That is how Ruthie Gilmore defines racism. And racialization is the discursive reproduction of racial meaning. I describe it as discursive because it's constantly in motion, right? The ways that we make meaning of race has never been static, right? There's been some threads of consistency with regard to like the fallacy of white supremacy, but other than that, it's shape-shifting. And actually, Stuart Hall describes race as a floating signifier, right? And so race means different things in different contexts. Like what my Blackness means, you know, in the context of my family is different than what my Blackness means in the context of higher education, for example, right? And so people are constantly negotiating what race means, how it matters in ways that can either be racist or anti-racist, right? And so that's why we're here today, to really make sure that we're not leaning on conceptualizations of race that are connected to racism, but we're liberating that from that towards anti-racism. And so when we're talking about racial equity and like why racial equity matters, again, we go back to the definition of racism from Ruthie Gilmore, right? So why racial equity? Well, because the ways that our society makes sense of racial difference still disproportionately puts Black, Indigenous, and people of color at risk of premature death. So, in other words, racial bias quite literally kills BIPOC. Like that is ultimately what's at stake, and that's why racial equity matters. And so I also think it's important to name that a focus on racial equity is not situating race as more important than other categories, right? It's not, we're not playing a game of oppression Olympics, right? So instead, we should understand race as a structuring system that intersects with other systems of power to confer privilege or oppression. So, I get all the time like, well, why would we focus on race instead of focusing on class, or instead of focusing on first gen status, or instead of focusing on disability? And if we were to use kind of disability as an example, a real analysis of disability, a thorough analysis of disability and the ways that that impacts the learning of folks within higher education would recognize the history of eugenics and scientific racism in forwarding a notion that links race to ability in the first place, right? So the fact that disproportionately Black folks and Black boy identified folks particularly are overrepresented in IEPs, that's something to take notice of. That's a racialized incident that is then becomes intertwined with other structures of power. So it basically, racial equity matters because it requires an intersectional understanding. And so in this way, we should also consider racialization or race in action, right? What race means, rather than only rather than only understanding race as a static identity or categorical variable, right? Because again, race doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. We're constantly making sense of that. In terms of why the classroom, I am biased because I definitely, my work is purely situated within classroom context. And I should say that I ended up pursuing a PhD largely because I worked in higher education, particularly in the graduate school in an office of diversity and inclusion. And a lot of the things that we were doing were co-curricular in nature. And so rather than necessarily like having conversations with faculty who were microaggressing students, we were having workshops with students about like how to deal with microaggressions, right? And that I personally think that that's not the way that we affect change, right? From an equity mindedness perspective, again, practitioners are to take accountability of the ways that they are impacting students, right? So Henry Giroux writes that traditional education theory has ignored not only the latent principles that shape the deep grammar of the existing social order, but also those principles that underlie the development and nature of its own view of the world. Schools and these perspectives are seen as merely instructional sites. That they are also cultural and political sites is ignored, as is the notion that they represent arenas of contestation and struggle among differentially powered cultural and economic groups, right? So why the classroom? Because the classroom is a particular site of racial meaning making. And Zeus Leonardo and Manning talk about education as being part of a historical process. Education is the pedagogical dimension of politics. Like there is no escaping the politicized nature of what we do in the classroom. And actually, if you think about research on higher education, research particularly around the importance of interactional diversity, college classrooms, or college generally, and college classrooms are really kind of some of the first places that people may be interacting with people who are very different from them, especially given the way that redlining has affected, issues of segregation, like the afterlives of racial segregation, even after segregation became illegal through redlining communities. Particularly, I can talk about my own home of Chicago. Chicago is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. So really thinking about the opportunities that exist for racial meaning making and for understanding diversity as an asset, the college classroom is a crucial site for that. And Nasir, Snyder, Shaw, and Ross discuss racial storylines and kind of how classrooms become the opportunity to reify or disrupt racial storylines, or the stories that we tell about what race means, right? So Asian folks are good at math, or Black boys don't, um, I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat at the same time. I'm going to answer your question, Brian, in a second. Or, Black boys have behavior issues, right? Again, messages, they say that messages about race are not created in school settings so much as they are filtered, reproduced, reimagined, and enacted there. So again, the idea of the classroom as being a socio-political context in which people are actively making sense of, and in some cases resisting, normative notions of what race means, that's radically important. And I would argue that whether or not that's happening explicitly or implicitly, it's always happening. Race is always present. Racial meaning is always present. And so redlining, historically, I'll drop a link in the chat in a little bit later, but it refers to the process of how districts are how districts are split up, and also basically like who is allowed to buy property where. So it has roots in housing segregations. It's basically like the process through which white supremacy continues to function with regard to like property rights, housing property rights, and who has access to what neighborhoods. So I'm sorry, I didn't define that earlier. So going back to the classroom, I take my notes from Bell Hooks, who describes the classroom as being the most radical space of possibility in the university. So really what happens in the classroom deeply, deeply matters for how students learn, and their learning matters for how students understand themselves and understand the world. So what the work that we're doing is radically important. So I wouldn't be an educator if I didn't have some type of, activity for folks to do. So I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second, and I'm going to invite folks to I'm going to put the link in the chat, yellkey.com/Western. Yellkey, YELL key.com/Western. And I'm going to invite you to answer the question, what type of education do we want to provide our students? So take a minute and go ahead and start to populate that for me. Rachel, I see you put welcoming and inclusive. And I'm going to share as people start to populate that. It's being a little fickle. Give me 1 second. Are folks finding the link okay? Feel free to put in the chat if you're having issues. Okay, so I see empowering, one that liberates and empowers them, applicable and equitable, high quality, accurate and useful. Let's see. An effective education, well-rounded and relevant, broad, neutral. I'd love to hear more about that in the chat. Empowering and enlightening, a meaningful education that is transformational and gives the students the skills that will last a lifetime. Encouraging curiosity, having a transformational experience, holistic, liberating. I love that. We're going to talk more about that. Accessible, thorough education that promotes critical thinking. Awesome. You all are on the right track. And so I'm going to save this for you all. And I'm going to share it with Landon also, so you all can continue to come back to this during the course of your symposium. But thank you for participating in that activity with me. Okay, so in terms of thinking about what types of education we want to provide our students, that's like one aspect. That's an important aspect of what it is that we're doing today. The second aspect that sometimes we don't properly differentiate is like, what does that mean for the ways that we design learning and schooling, right? Because sometimes we conflate what schooling is with what education is. And education is not schooling all the time, right? Like sometimes the education that we receive in schools is harmful to us. Like it does not serve us well, particularly for BIPOC students. So again, when we're thinking about accessibility, when we're thinking about a transformational stance, when we're thinking about liberating, having a liberating education, those are the types of things that we have to keep in mind when we're deciding what and how we are designing learning for students within our schooling context. And so design matters. I'm a learning scientist, and a lot of what we talk about within the learning sciences is educational design. And so Philip, Bang, and Jackson talk about a focus on design being necessarily attended to the how, the for what, the for whom, and the with whom of educational design. And so, in other words, designing for the types of education that we want to have present in our school requires a commitment to praxis. So critical reflection and action. And that's what y'all are here doing today. So you're totally on the right track with that. You're here reflecting on your own practice, learning how to do things differently. And also, I would argue that it requires a commitment to iteration, right? We're not always going to get it right the first time, and that's okay. And in fact, if we're really being equitable and justice oriented in our practices shift depending on who we're designing for, right? And so what one group of students might need may be different from what another group of students might need. And that's good and okay for us to be constantly reflecting and iterating on our practice. And so ultimately, we must simultaneously consider what we are designing towards and what we are designing away from, right? I'm just going to open the chat. I see some stuff happening in the chat. Yes, what we teach does not always equate to what students learn. I really appreciate you naming that. And so really being attentive also about how students are interacting with what it is that we're presenting to them is really important. And so, Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, I've been privileged to learn with her, from her. She's one of my mentors and committee members. She coined the term equity mindedness, and she defines equity mindedness along with colleagues from the Center of Urban Education at USC as the perspective or mode of thinking exhibited by practitioners who call attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes And it's not only the calling attention piece that matters, but then they work to address troubling findings, right? And so it's like noticing, learning to notice differently, and then doing something about it, right? So again, this idea of praxis is super intertwined with equity mindedness as being part of critical reflection and action. And so practitioners, she argues, must shift their mindsets from deficit oriented paradigms that place blame on students of color for what are truly failures of the system, right? And so I saw someone mention earlier in the chat as well that, again, we need to stop blaming students of color for problems that they did not create, right? That they inherit but did not create. Challenges, equity mindedness challenges the propensity for race evasiveness in higher education practice, right? And so, where we might want to explain away something as an attempt to not have a genuine and open conversation about race, equity mindedness is always bringing it back to a racial analysis, and particularly an intersectional racial analysis, right? Because understanding how race operates and how racial meaning occurs necessitates understanding multiple systems of power and how they're happening simultaneously. Um, they talk about equity mindedness as providing a means of corrective justice. And so you might have read a piece a while ago by Dr. Gloria Latson Billings, who really turns the idea of the achievement gap on its head and says, like, no, this is not an achievement gap. Actually, the system of education owes an educational debt to students of color who they have underserved historically over time, right? And so understanding equity mindedness as being about a process or a means of corrective justice is an important way to ground our work together. Also, there's a focus on practitioner inquiry. So again, it's not only how we're making sense of data and how we're making sense of different patterns of either student outcomes, student experiences, but also what are we doing about that, right? So it's creating a plan of action, and that's central to equity mindedness. And in terms of, this is really challenging. And so I'm also reading the chat. It says, we've seen the shift in K-12 where ELD no longer means English language deficient, but it's now English language developing. And so I appreciate you raising that, Kat, thinking about the types of language that we use and the types of meanings, right, that gets associated, whether it's deficit-based or asset-based, is really important. Language matters deeply. And there's a chapter in Bell Hooks's Teaching to Transgress, which really that was super formative to me as an educator, and really informed kind of how I think about my work also with faculty. There's a whole chapter on language in that book, so you might enjoy that. So in terms of equity mindedness and practitioner inquiry particularly, I think practitioner inquiry is super important, and equity mindedness, particularly a praxis of equity mindedness, is crucial to closing equity gaps. And it's deeply important and honorable work. And that's what y'all are coming here to do today. You're coming here saying, like, we recognize that there's a problem and we are committed to fixing it. That is important. However, I also want to name that it's important that we don't get stuck in cycles of inquiry, right? Because what we can do is start to just continuously look for patterns in student outcomes in which students are being underserved and hitting the small, like trying to solve the smaller problems. Again, to move from equity to justice demands that we imaginatively redesign our structures and systems such that the equity gaps that we're currently noticing, those patterns, those gaps that we're finding out about here today, that they no longer exist. We need to imagine first, and then design for a system of education where there can be no equity gaps, because we're not allowing students to to fall through the gaps. And so a reflection question that I encourage you all to work through as you're engaging in, understanding more about equity mindedness, reflecting on your practice, learning more about high impact practices, equity minded practices, I should say. How can I reimagine my college, school, department, classroom, and pedagogical approach? Because again, it's all of this is nested and layered. How can I reimagine all of that to more intentionally center equity and justice, right? So equity is super important in equity is super important in remediating the types of experiences that students of color are having right now. And it's important that we're designing away from the types of structures that allow those equity gaps to exist in the first place. So we're constantly engaging with our practice as it is, while also reimagining what is the gold star, what is the North Star, right? What should we be doing? And so Dr. Tuitt, Haynes, and Stewart they do work on equity mindedness, particularly around teaching Black students. And one of their articles, I just love this quote. They said that much of what was learned about teaching in the respective disciplines has to be unlearned so that all educators are capable of nurturing Black brilliance, right? And so, like a lot of times, particularly within professional development, we talk about learning outcomes, right? And I'm starting to think about, like, okay, yes, let's talk about learning outcomes, but what also might be some unlearning outcomes, right? Like, what types of things do we need to unlearn to be able to relearn the way that we want to engage, the way that we want to engage with each other, to design the types of educational experiences that BIPOC students deserve. And BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I think, from my perspective, that our task in that is creating opportunities for love, life, and liberation. And I don't always, when I read folks' teaching philosophies, or when when I interview faculty about what it is that they perceive to be their job, like what is the core work of teaching. A lot of times I hear about content knowledge, right? We need students to learn the stuff that they're in our classes to learn. And that is radically important, right? Because that's what we're here to do. And there's ways to be attuned to the how of teaching as well, particularly given the populations of the students that we're working with. And so Bell Hooks writes that love is a combination of 6 ingredients: care, commitment, responsibility, respect, and trust. And I believe that love, all of those things, are central and essential to the practice of teaching. And so, some questions that you can begin to ask yourself about how love manifests, if and how, right, love manifests within your work, how you conceptualize your work as an educator. How, if at all, do you manifest love in your classroom or in your pedagogical practice? Like, what does care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust, what roles do those things play in how you're designing your pedagogy, and how you're crafting your curriculum or your syllabus, and how you're executing the expectations that you have with students? How do you nurture a love of learning, right, for your students? I think one of the most important gifts that I've gotten from some of the most influential educators to me has been nurturing kind of a love of curiosity and a love of learning. That's something that's really important, and can be considered part of our jobs as educators, right? Also, what, if any, models of love do you have from your own schooling experiences, right? So, have there been professors or teachers within your schooling experiences that made you feel particularly loved, particularly understood, particularly affirmed, particularly valued, right? What did they do? And how might you be able to take that up in your own practice as an educator? And you know, for some folks, again, given the way that schooling is structured, maybe it's not schooling that you've had, you know, models of love in. Maybe it's other educational contexts, right? So I know for me, within college, particularly within ethnic studies, I felt really affirmed and loved. But particularly within at Northwestern, they have something called the Black House and the Multicultural Center, and those were my homes away from home. I felt so deeply loved in those spaces, and so I try to pick up on, like, okay, what was it that Miss Jure was doing when I was in this setting that made me feel like that I may be able to gift to my students, right? Because that, again, being loved changes the way that we orient ourselves to the work that we do, to what is possible, and to each other, right? And so thinking about teaching and learning as being two sides of the same coin, right? As educators, we're also learners, and we're constantly learning from our students. And I think practicing an ethic of love makes that even more possible. Life. Life is critically important, especially again, when we think about how Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism as group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Life is necessarily anti-racist, right? Choosing to live, choosing to like create opportunities for people's lives to be affirmed, and to feel alive, right, within classroom context rather than feeling oppressed within classroom context. That's radically important. And so to cite Henry Giroux again, he writes that what's at stake here is not simply the issue of bad teaching, right? But it's the broader refusal to take seriously the categories of meaning, experience, and voice that students use to make sense of themselves and the world around them. Um, Thank you, Jacqueline, for really elevating. You in the chat, you said I attended an HBCU as an undergrad, and my education experience there fits with Bell Hooks' definition of love. Right. So again, like this idea of like who we are, right? What is the culture? How do we define ourselves in relation to our students? That's important for how students experience it. And I think that there's particular culture within HBCUs that are different than white serving institutions, right? And so thinking about what about that experience made that, you know, made you feel loved, and taking that up and amplifying that, as I'm sure you already do within your praxis, spot on. And in terms of life, you know, what Henry Giroux is talking about around categories of meaning, experience, and voice, I think about that as lived experience, right? So the refusal to take seriously the lived experience of students to make sense of themselves. And so in a world that literally and metaphorically threatens the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, how do you speak life over your BIPOC students, right? Like, what does that mean, to affirm life within your students within a world that fundamentally does not do the same, right? That it's actually counter to the ways that like systems and structures of education are set up to do that, right? So that you know what Jacqueline was describing around her experience, oh, I'm sorry, around their experience at HBCUs becomes the norm rather than the exception, right? For Black students. So also, how do the curricular materials you use affirm or deny the humanity and legitimacy of the unique perspectives and experiential knowledge that BIPOC students bring to your classroom? One way to affirm the lives of students is by feeding them information, feeding them curriculum that affirms their lives, right? So if you have a syllabus and your syllabus, or you have a classroom, right? And your classroom is racially diverse, and your syllabus does not is not representative of the types of knowledges and experiences that students within your classroom have, that's problematic, right? I mean, and that would be problematic. Having a diverse syllabus is important for everybody, and it has different implications for students of color who are learning within the classroom versus white students, right? Um, And I see your question, Karina, and I'm going to come back to that after this last slide. So liberation. Liberation is key. And Bell Hooks, quoting Paulo Freire, talks about reconceptualizing education and thus the practice of teaching as being necessarily about a practice of freedom. And so self-actualization is a central goal of teaching. It should be a central goal, right? We're teaching students to learn for themselves, to think for themselves, to be self-determined, right? It's not us saving anybody, right? We're privileging self-determination over becoming a savior. So some questions that we might ask about that is, how can you support students in developing tools that free themselves and their communities and loved ones by themselves and for themselves? So what types of knowledges, what types of discourses, what types of relationships do students need to get themselves and their communities free? Like, I think that that's a central part of what we are in the classroom to do. How can your classroom function as a safe space for students to be themselves or to be free? Like, how can students be free in your classrooms, right? And what would it mean for students to feel liberated by your pedagogy? What would that require of you and of your pedagogy? Those types of questions are central if we're taking seriously equity mindedness, and we're taking seriously the idea that we are here to get ourselves and each other free, right? And so I want to quickly go back to Karina's question. So Karina writes, in higher education, the students come to us with an already established multitude of inequities. Yes, we have basic competencies and standards that we are required to meet, and these are established by state committees that we have little influence. How do we overcome the barrier of time to get these students to the level that they need to be? You know, I wish I had the answer to that question. I think that part of the challenging thing, like you're saying, is that educators, quite frankly, are constrained by the constrained in many ways by the context in which they're teaching, right? And so there's certain standards, even like from the K-12 perspective, there's certain standards that teachers are expected to stick within, and figuring out like how to get around those can very much be difficult. And so unfortunately, I don't have an answer necessarily to that, but I hope that that's something that you all continue to explore together in terms of like practical applications of what it is that we're talking about, because what you're raising is incredibly important. And I see Jean wrote in the chat, it has to do with our policies in the classroom, the way that we interact with students, and the ways we either gatekeep or teach. Yes, yes. And noticing what types of policies are hindering equity-minded practice is also really generative, right? Like, even if we don't know what the alternative is, now, Karina, you're raising that, like, this is something that we need to focus on as a system, right? And advocacy needs to happen around. So thank you for taking that up. So one of the things that I also wanted to give people the opportunity to think about is, now that we've talked about the what, right? How can we design schooling experiences that create pathways to love, life, and liberation for our students? And I think that, like, you all are talking more about that, like, within the chat. So I'm hoping that we are saving the chat as an artifact to then come back to. And so I just encourage you all to think about that over time. I also wanted to amplify really quickly what James is saying in the chat. The more equity-minded I've become and the better I've become at teaching the students that are being referred to as having a multitude of inequities, the less time becomes an issue. These students are capable. It is us and our practices that are the barrier, not a barrier of time. I really appreciate you naming that, James. That's really important. And again, like interpreting kind of the structural and material barrier, or no, yeah, the structural and material challenges as not barriers, but challenges, right? We can hold space for both of those to be the reality. And still, it's our job to overcome that. And we can do that together, I believe. So I want to end with a quote from Dr. Bettina Love. And she wrote a book on abolitionist teaching that is like chef's kiss. And she writes, so the question is not, do you have love? I'm sorry. The question is not, do you love all children? The question is, will you fight for Black and brown children? And how will you fight? I argue that you must fight with creativity, imagination, urgency, boldness, ingenuity, and rebellious spirit of abolitionists to advocate for an education system where all Black and brown children are thriving. To love all children, we must struggle together to create the schools we are taught to believe are impossible. Schools built on justice, love, joy, and anti-racism. And I know that that's the type of deep work that you all are committed to. And so I commend you on coming together to take up this work, to not only reimagine your practice, but to reimagine the entire system of schooling for the Colorado community college system. Like, what types of experiences, what do you want students to say about their experience of learning within your classrooms, within the college, within the broader system? I'm sure that you want to say that it's a school built on justice, love, joy, and anti-racism. And so I'm just excited that you all have come together to do that you've invited me. I look forward to staying in community with you all. If you ever have any questions, you can feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to be a resource to you all in whatever way I can. And so thank you again, Landon, for inviting me. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there's still time.
Yeah, thank you so much. There was a question about whether you would have or would make available the slides. And I'm assuming yes. If you would send them to me, then I can send them out. There was also a question about a recording of the session, and we are recording. And we will produce a transcript of the session as well and make that available to individuals after today. So we will send those out. I'm just trying to read the questions here. There's also a question around a reference list.
I can
You had
share.
cited a lot of folks, which is great. I did throw into the chat Bella Hook's book, or one of her books, and for individuals. Looking to see if there are other questions. If there's a question missed, we do have a couple minutes left. If you would maybe retype it, that would be great.
I can transcribe at least the one that came in through the QA section rather than through the chat,
okay.
Which was, I love these quotes, messages, and evidence for making these shifts in our mindsets and approach to the classroom. Do you have an anecdote or teaching moment you have experienced that demonstrates applying these ideas to real-time critical pedagogy or classroom interactions?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking that. I think one of the things that I've been really attuned to, particularly within a COVID context, is just how capacity is different, right? And like what learning objectives need to be in terms of like scope and sequence, right? So being more flexible with scope and sequence. So I'm teaching right now co-teaching a qualitative methods course with a professor at Russier for master's students in the higher education program. And so, you know, these folks are working all day within higher education and then coming at the end of their work day to class to try to like learn about research. And so what we've been doing in terms of making that transition less stark, we've started every class with some sort of like breathing exercise or and or kind of critical reflection, and then giving them the opportunity to share with each other, and making these really connected to the themes that we're talking about. So for example, when we were talking about narrative inquiry, we were teaching folks about narrative inquiry as a methodology. We gave students the prompt to kind of narrate like an aspect of their lives that they felt was important. Like who are you bringing into the space? Who's important to you? And then they got the chance to share that. And then we were able to link that to like, you know, interview processes, right? Because students were like asking each other questions. We were able to link that to be able to understand kind of themes that came up in the conversation. So there was like a very practical element of it, but it was also like a way for folks to kind of decompress, to be critically reflective about like somebody they love, that they, you know, learned from, that they wanted to bring into the space at the same time. So I'm always looking for opportunities for students to like infuse part of themselves within the teaching and learning that I do. And that also helps me learn more about my students, which I think ultimately helps me serve them better. I hope that answers your question.
And looking at the Q&A, one other question, it says, and this might come with a resource list that you might provide. It says, do you have any literature suggestions to get people started to making institutional change or recognizing inequities in institutions? So if there's any suggestions there, feel free to add, either say them or add them to your list.
Yeah, I'll definitely add it to the list. And also, the Center for Urban Education at USC has a really robust resources page that also shares a bunch of great resources, tools for faculty practitioners to use within their own practice. So that could be a good place to start as well. And I'll link that on the resource list that I share with you all.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing other questions in Q&A. A lot of comments and gratitude. I hope you're feeling that from the crowd. So I just want to take a moment then to really thank you for your time today. Appreciate you being here. I know I have copious notes that I'm excited for. I have not read Bella Hook's book. I was chatting with Ryan Ross offline saying, I need to read it, and he showed me a picture that he's reading it now. So I need to get that book and